Obviously, Americans have a certain equity in being able to spin an issue saying that, an invasion could be imminent.
Yeah.
Now, everyone's talked about 2027, given that it's going to be 100 years of the PLA, etc., all of that. I'm a little skeptical, not because I'm necessarily concerned about China's capacity to do things or Xi Jinping's resolute will to do things. I think China also probably is taking lessons from the kind of experience that Russia has had in Ukraine. Short, sharp wars, short, sharp takeovers are easier said than done.
Right. So if any country still has the ability to surge, even now, I would say China still retains that ability to surge. And not only retains the ability to surge in terms of increased spending, but they've got the ability to surge in terms of industrial capacity.
Exactly.
The US in today, if they want to surge in terms of shipbuilding, whatever money they throw, they can't do it because they don't have the shipbuilding capacity. Good afternoon, everyone. And once again, welcome to all of you to the next episode of WM Dialogues. Today, once again, for my guest, I have Professor Dattesh Parulekar. As you all know, he heads the School of International Relations and Area Studies at Goa University and is a strong advocate and supporter of all military establishments in the country, including the Naval War College and the National Defense College. Today, I thought we'll discuss the Western Pacific. It's an interesting area because there's a lot that is happening over there in the region. The security architecture of the Western Pacific, I would say, was drawn up at the end of the Second World War by the San Francisco Treaty, where you had a web of Western alliances, with the US being the predominant security provider. You have, prominent amongst these, I would say, is the security treaties that you have between the US and Japan, the Mutual Defense Treaty between the US and Korea, another Mutual Defense Treaty between the US and Philippines. You have the Taiwan Relations Act, which applies to Taiwan. You have Thailand, which is, maybe a not that committed alliance partner, but as I say, has an alliance relationship. You have Australia, distant of course, which is again another alliance partner. And you have US territories in Guam, in the Marianas, and then going on to Hawaii, of course, which is a state. In between, you have strong security relationships with countries such as Singapore, which play a major role over there. The Western Pacific of late has become contested, and the biggest driver for that contestation has been the unprecedented rise of China over the last, since Deng Xiaoping. So you're talking about the 80s onwards, I would say, is that the big change has really started. And one of the major areas in which that change is taking place is in the maritime domain. I mean, the changes are just enormous in terms of the buildup of Chinese maritime power. You take and you see maritime in all its dimensions. The largest navy in the world in terms of numbers, if not in terms of tonnage, the largest coast guard in the world, the largest distant water fishing fleet in the world, the largest fleet of survey and research vessels in the world, the largest fleet of the largest port operator in the world, amongst the largest provider of manpower for shipping in the world, the largest shipbuilder in the world. So, I mean, the list is endless. On any factor maritime, you find China's there right on top. So it's a big change, and I thought if you can unpack this change in terms of on the political side of the house, and maybe its overlay on the security side of the house as well.
Yeah, thank you, Admiral Khanna. Always a pleasure to join you in a conversation. Let me begin by what you talked about by harking back to the Cold War. In the Cold War, and in fact, why I say this is because when we look at, let's say, the Soviet Union, which was the peer power to the United States back in the Cold War, and China now, there are some characteristic distinctions and differences that we must come to terms with. Firstly, no country in recent history, in the last 100 years, has really been able to amass a GDP which is 70% of the United States. Even at their prime, the Soviet Union was not at that economic heft. And the Chinese are 70% of US GDP. The Soviet Union was not a Pacific country the way China is. China is a resident Pacific power. The Soviets had a Pacific fleet. So their focus attention was not really on the Pacific as being the central theater, but for China, the Pacific is everything. Thirdly, when we look at the Soviet Union had its own technological advancements, but China really has mastered the art of what I call as the MITC. We often talk of the military industrial complex, but they've really been able to bring the technological component and underpin it to military, to industry, and to defense itself. In fact, I would say even to society. So they have brought in the military, the industrial, the societal, and the technology into one construct. And that is why it becomes a much more comprehensively potent power. And therefore, countries obviously cannot think in other terms. During the Cold War, you had a sense of mutual exclusivity. So both of these superpowers hardly dealt with each other in terms of trade. But today, as the United States and China are in this fiendish competition between trade, industry, and technology, they're also trading. And so this increasing intertwining that we have seen in the 21st century, of which China has been a big beneficiary, going from being an impoverished peasant country in 1980 to actually a $19 trillion economy in 2025, speaks volumes. But what you also said is interesting. China is a maritime pioneering nation. As we speak, there is talk of a third aircraft carrier, the Fujian, which will be commissioned soon. And we're also hearing that China is going to do its first trials in June of what they call as the aerial drone aircraft carrier. Now, this is something the Americans have not even looked at, right? So clearly, they're not just any other maritime nation. They're a maritime nation that is also a pioneering nation. And this focus is something that the Americans have to come to terms with. The second aspect really that has to be looked at is there is a cartographic reimagination of what really is the Pacific. And I would say there are three clusters of issues in which the Western Pacific finds itself bogged down. The first is Northeast Asia, where you have denuclearization issues. Although everyone stopped talking about North Korea lately because things seem to have subsided. But the threat that North Korea poses with its constant endeavor at ballistic missile systems is something that cannot be wished away. And if in any way North Korea's regime has to be made to change its disposition, it is not going to matter what South Korea and Japan think, or for that matter, the US and Russians think. It's going to matter how China handles that issue. So that's a very important issue. The second issue, which is basically in the East China Sea, and that concerns, of course, Japan with Senkaku and Taiwan, of course, is this very hard-nosed, abrasive military assertion by China. They have done this with Japan on the Senkaku, and they're doing it constantly now with this constant encroachment and transgression of Taiwanese waters. That's the second issue that has to be dealt with. And the third set of issue is the complexity of the maritime disputes that China has with the whole bulk of ASEAN countries. So the security calculus that's being drawn up in the Western Pacific is a combination of traditional nuclear issues that also remain relevant, of issues of maritime dispute, which are not just maritime jurisdiction, but also matters of lawfare, and then simply a case of conventional military competition, which you see in the East China Sea. So I would say all that you discuss about the Western Pacific essentially slots into these three tiers of issues.
Very interesting. So I just thought I'll highlight on two issues that you mentioned over here. Yeah. One is, of course, is that conventional wisdom tells us that China largely has been developing at least their military assets through reverse engineering. But in the recent years, they have really broken that mold, as you mentioned. The Type 076, for the first time, you're putting a catapult on what is an LPD carrier, an LPD ship, or an LHA, which is a large helicopter ship, which no one has done this in the past. You built their own dedicated drone carrier, which is a 200-meter ship. I mean, not as large as maybe a Type 076, but it's a large ship all the same. You take in any field. I mean, you look at the 055 destroyer. You look at. They have gone past the stage where you're simply reverse engineering or analyzing what the West is doing, and you're trying to catch up. I mean,
they're breaking new ground. Yeah,
you're breaking new ground. The second thing is regarding in comparison with the Cold War. I mean, really, what broke the Soviet Union was the arms race, in a sense that they just could not keep it up of spending 20 to 25% of their GDP
Yeah.
on keeping their military wherewithal build up and keeping it intact. China is much smarter in that respect.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, 18 and a half $1 trillion economy, but what they say, they're spending 1.3% of their GDP on defense. And if CIPRI marks it up by 50%, there are various people who mark it up. But I mean, there are studies done by AEI who say it has to be marked up, hugely. I mean,
Yeah.
to the tune of $700 billion.
Yeah.
Even if you take $700 billion, you're talking about 2.5% in that region.
Right.
I mean,
Right. Yeah.
it is not something that is unthinkable. The US is doing more than that. The US is spending 3.5 to 3.7% of the GDP on defense.
Right.
So if any country still has the ability to surge, even now, I would
Yeah.
say China still retains that ability to surge. And not only retains the ability to surge in terms of increased spending,
Yeah.
but they've got the ability to surge in terms of industrial capacity.
Exactly.
The US in today, if they want to surge in terms of shipbuilding,
Yeah.
whatever money they throw, they can't do it because they don't have the shipbuilding capacity.
Capacity, exactly.
Capacity
Absolutely.
itself is
Absolutely.
gone. Here you've got enormous number of shipyards, etc. So that ability is still with them. But that being set aside, so if you look at the area, there are multiple disputes in the area.
Yeah.
There's a South China Sea dispute that is going on. There's a Senkaku dispute which is on. And there is, on the Russian side, there are disputes which are in play over there. There's a dispute with the Philippines over, the Second Thomas Shoal
Yeah.
areas like that. Do you see that these stress points will be contained in the near term, or is there, particularly when it comes to Taiwan? Though I don't want to talk too much about Taiwan over here, we can keep that as a separate topic. But this so-called Davidson window of 2027 that you keep hearing about, of China aggressively looking at upping their ante in terms of a forced takeover of Taiwan. Do you think this is more of a US spin that is being put on these subjects, or is there are these things that we have to be concerned about?
Yeah, so obviously Americans have a certain equity in being able to spin an issue saying that an invasion could be imminent.
Yeah.
Now everyone's talked about 2027, given that it's going to be 100 years of the PLA, etc., all of that. I'm a little skeptical, not because I'm necessarily concerned about China's capacity to do things or Xi Jinping's resolute will to do things. I think China also probably is taking lessons from the kind of experience that Russia has had in Ukraine. Short, sharp wars, short, sharp takeovers are easier said than done. They are not quite sure of what it may lead them into. We don't quite know that if there is a direct assault on Taiwan, what would the two countries whose EEZs would get transgressed, namely Japan and Philippines, do? Will that be a regional coalition which will say now or never when it comes to stopping the Chinese? Because if they take over Taiwan, it just doesn't mean they take over the island. In terms of EEZs and what happens ultimately, the entire jurisdictional issue is going to go for a spin. So there are huge stakes involved in China being precipitous in its action against Taiwan. What we are probably lately seeing is maybe there won't be a full-scale invasion, but around 2027, 2028, the salami slicing that China is potentially doing with regard to the outer ring islands, that certainly will happen, but there'll be a lot more undermining of Taiwan and Taiwan's immediate waters through electronic warfare, through underwater domain activity, which will be more of a decapitating or more of a sabotaging nature. So I think the capability, trying to degrade the capability of Taiwan will be more important. We also have to keep in mind a full-scale invasion of Taiwan is not going to be just surrender of Taiwanese forces. It's going to lead to a lot of destruction in Taiwan. And would China want to destroy a Taiwan to take it back, given that it's so critical to your semiconductor industry? What would China get in return by ending up destroying? I mean, they're not going to do a Ukraine, right? The Russians could do a Ukraine, but if they do a Ukraine to Taiwan, what do they get in return? They effectively have killed the hen that lays the golden egg. So that's why I feel that there's going to be a lot more moderation. China's economy also necessarily is not doing great. It's doing fair. It's at 5% now, but it doesn't generate the kind of accelerated GDP that it does. It's got a lot of priorities, national level priorities at home. In fact, you see Xi Jinping has also walked back a little bit on his initial aggressive behavior against private capital, trying to welcome them in. So I think there is a certain pragmatism that is setting in China. I, for one, don't think that an invasion is imminent, but definitely they will do something in terms of 2027, 2028, which will have a salutary effect in signaling to the world that look, we are on the path of reunifying the island. I think that's what I see happening here.
So when it comes to the US, of course, the US, what they would like most is to preserve their hegemony in the Western Pacific. This I think is critical to them. This whole issue keeps coming up on the US commitment to Taiwan, but I think what really drives it is that if Taiwan were to fall, it would be the unraveling of the entire security architecture that was built up since the Second World War, because every country would hedge their bets at that stage and relook as to where their security interests are going to lie afresh, I would say. So in that sense, it is critical for them to if they want to preserve their maritime hegemony, to ensure that they walk the talk, and therefore they display their commitment. The instrument that the US has chosen to preserve their position of prima donna in the world is really the instrument of containment against China. And the military dimension of that containment, I think, was spelt out best during the Obama years with the pivot to Asia, which subsequently became the rebalance to Asia, which by Hillary Clinton. So there are a number of countries and leaders like Lee Kuan Yew who have spoken up against it and said, it is to think that you can contain China is absurd. That's what, and you have to look at balancing as a much better, instrument to use in that sense. So, do you think containment has a chance of succeeding in given China's rise and their position?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way in which containment is understood in its classical form, I think that's a non-starter. You're not going to be able to contain, you're not going to put the genie back into the bottle, something which is $19 trillion in GDP, right? And has the kind of industrial and military muscle and the technological ecosystem that China has. So while everyone talks of rebalancing, I would say managing. And managing would be also an important word, because countries seem to be wanting to manage the rise of China. And in this, we see a certain hedging strategy that has become a consistent staple of foreign policies of middle powers in the region, because most of them are middle powers really. And I would actually look at hedging coming from three different sides and three qualitative ways of hedging. The first is you can look at Singapore, which basically prioritizes relationship both with the United States and with China, but for very different reasons, right? But is a very cautious and very circumspect hedger in its own enlightened economic interest and technological interest. Malaysia is in the same boat. They are deeply invested, in terms of the BRI, in terms of being indebted, etc. So even though you have Anwar Ibrahim, who is a very different leader, he's also basically, in a sense, had to manage his relations with China, which is why in ASEAN's chair right now, in Malaysia's chair of ASEAN, we've seen a situation now that he's talked about holding the first meeting with the GCC. So you're going to have a GCC ASEAN summit on the sidelines of the summit meeting, which is being pushed by China. So I think Malaysia and Singapore qualify as circumspect or cautious hedgers. While preserving a relationship with the US, they also want to manage the relationship with China. The other is Vietnam. Very interesting. All of us were betting on Vietnam becoming the ASEAN tiger who would stand up to China. And we've seen a very gradual pivot in the post-COVID era, to the point where in the recent visit that Xi Jinping had, they formalized a mechanism that they put in place in December of last year, which was, countries often talk of 2+2. We have a first unique experiment where China and Vietnam now have put in place a 3+3. And that 3+3 is not just a quibble on numbers where 2 becomes 3. What is that 3? That 3 is a dialogue mechanism concurrently with foreign and defense ministers of public security ministers. Now we all understand what public security in China is. Internal order, regime coercion, right? Surveillance, information warfare. So what you are seeing is not just China and Vietnam coming together as strategic partners. Their two communist parties are now giving command and control directions to both sides, saying, let's get the two communist parties together. And Lotham, in fact, that time Secretary General actually said so, that we are not just two countries now, we are actually two communist parties that are sisters of each other. And the biggest beneficiary has been Vietnam in the post-COVID era in terms of economic relocation of Chinese units. So At the same time, they maintain a comprehensive strategic partnership with the United States. So I would put their hedging into what I call as vibrant hedging, where the hedging is productive on both ends. It's not a defensive hedging, it's a very vibrant hedging, it's a very proactive hedging. And I would put Japan in the same category. Japan, in the last, let's say, 7-8 years, across leaderships, has begun to take this view that while their alliance with the United States is core, it's very important that they calibrate their engagement with China. This, of course, started with late Abe Shinzo actually stopping going to the Asukuni Shrine, which is what he did, not to offend the sensitivities. And we now have got to a situation where the current leader, Ishiba Shigeru, is actually preparing for a state visit of Xi Jinping to Japan sometime this year. And many in Japan do say, of course, there are many also who decry it, that probably he is the one prime minister most amenable to China in a long, long time that Japan has seen. So in the case of Japan as well, it is this very vibrant hedging. And then you have the likes of Philippines, which has done a very roller coaster, very aggressive kind of hedging. And of course, I say this aggressive hedging because it basically then flips from one presidency to the other. With Noy Aquino, when the PCA ruling came out in 2016, with regard to their maritime disputes, he took a position of trying to counsel China into accepting it. He did not succeed. You had Duterte who came in, and Duterte swung to the Chinese side, almost wanted to scrap the EDCA. And now you have, of course, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who's again swung back more to the Americans. So there is an aggressive hedging. But hedging is a consistent approach that countries have taken to manage this problem between how much of containment and how much of managing of China.
So, you've talked a lot about Japan also. So let's switch to Japan in that respect. So you've mentioned, of course, that they have really switched to a position of hedging to some extent. But in many ways, I would say they have also, from a security standpoint, aligned themselves to the US. If you look at their NSS, the NDS, as well as their National Defense Building 20, all these three documents came out in 2023. There seems to be a strong alignment of their armed forces in the operating philosophy. If you take on the, even I would say, on their assets that they've acquired, on the large presence of US troops on the soil, on how they will complement US forces, in military actions, etc. So, how do you reconcile this? That on one side you want to hedge, and on the other side you've pushed out a series of documents, and you've also articulated, using the extended deterrence philosophy, etc. That you will be a strong supporter of the United States. If it came down to a kinetic issue with China.
Yeah, so in the case of Japan, I mean, let's step back a little bit. I would see it a little differently. I think a rethink in Japan began immediately after the pivot to Asia. Because when Senkaku, of course, happened in 2010, etc., the message from President Obama was clear to Japan that, look, we stand with you, and we definitely accept your right, your jurisdiction over Senkaku Islands in terms of the dispute. But it's also incumbent upon Tokyo not to escalate this or not to contribute to its escalation. And in that event, the Americans were quite equivocating, and that left a kind of a very bitter, taste in the Japanese mouth. They began to question the credibility and the fortitude of United States in defending on them on an issue as important as the Senkaku Islands, which is quite clearly a case of territorial, integrity. Ever since then, what we have seen is, while the alliance with the United States will always remain a bedrock of Japanese preparedness in the region, they have begun to find their own pragmatic ways of also building autonomous capability. And what we saw with Kishida Fumio, when he took over, and his visit to India, when he announced at the ICWA lecture that he gave, when he talked of a new FOIP, many called it the FOIP 2.0. If you look at some of the provisioning in FOIP 2.0, one of the most critical ones was Japan will actually now militarize smaller states. Very strategic militarization of smaller states. You would never have expected the Japanese to speak in this language, but the Japanese self-defense forces would now actually look to militarize or build autonomous capabilities or empower smaller states, but do that in a defensive manner, not do that in an offensive manner. If you look at the national security strategy, the national defense framework, and also the national build-up plan, all three of them have the relationship with the United States at their core. But while it cements this relationship, it also brings in new dimensions. And the new dimensions are that Japan has to develop its own military industry, its arms industry, that Japan has to build its own autonomous capabilities. And we could not have expected this maybe a decade or 2, 3 decades ago, where Japan will actually go to build its next generation fighter aircraft with Italy and not with the United States. You would have thought that this was just a done deal, that they would look at the United States and not beyond the United States. But the fact that they're looking at it beyond the United States clearly shows they want to basically have a spectrum of capabilities that are diversified portfolios with different countries. So there is this distributed defense build-up that they want to do without in any way foregoing any of the the alliance with the United States. In fact, when Secretary Hegseth was recently in Japan, in fact, they have rechristened their own command now. And they, in fact, Hegseth announced that the operations command in Japan, the US operations command in Japan, is now going to be a war-fighting command. And it's not going to be a defensive command. So Japan has agreed to that. They see that as leverage and deterrence on a China that is now becoming muscular. But they also realize that they don't want to go down the path of being subsumed by the United States. Because the United States' containment of China, unfortunately, is still one-dimensional, and that is militaristic. The Americans have not yet found the economic public goods by which they can probably contain China. And that's why all containment that the Americans put out tends to be militaristic, and therefore countries that want to maintain this nifty balance,
Right.
they kind of try to stay away from it.
So, you mentioned a very interesting point of militarization of smaller states.
Yeah.
And I want to sort of, one place where this contestation, I would say, between China and the West is playing out
Yeah.
is the Southern Pacific Islands.
Yeah.
If you take Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Fiji, more recently Cook Islands, they're all sort of striking their own deals with China. China's penetration in all these countries is going up pretty dramatically. So Japan is certainly seen as a security partner, but the country I think that is most concerned, of course, is Australia.
Right.
Yeah. In that sense, when it comes to this part of the world, do you find that some sort of a collective effort between maybe the US, Australia, Japan, using their trilateral framework, etc., can sort of play a greater role? Or do you see these countries looking at it from their own security perspective and doing something as separate standalone efforts?
Yeah, so the point remains that obviously this has been one of the big concerns that not just United States or Australia share, but a lot of regional countries share about the Chinese rise, this spectacular rise in the South Pacific. The Americans, of course, have tried to do this in their own way. Many would say that AUKUS, and if you talk to many Australian experts, they say that while a lot of focus of AUKUS is on the submarines that the United States will provide Australia, AUKUS is much more than just submarines. AUKUS is really an enabling framework by which the United States and Australia can build these multilateral, larger frameworks, which can go into technology transfer, which can go into capacity building, which can go into securitization of the islands. The Australians at some level now have been looking for a slightly autonomous pathway. So if you see the current government of Albanese, which has been of course re-elected, they haven't really had a conversation with Washington on how to coordinate strategy with the Pacific Islands, South Pacific Islands. On the contrary, they seem to be deepening their relation with Indonesia. And there's been a talk of how Indonesia, Australia can work together. In fact, the trilateral that we have, the minilateral that we have, because we have stakes in the South Pacific as well. And given our good relationship with Canberra and our good relationship with Jakarta, and particularly with the current president, Prabowo Subianto, this India, Indonesia, Australia trilateral actually being the framework. And I think there is a realization here, and this is what I've been saying for quite some time. Middle powers are now beginning to understand that overemphasis on US participation actually escalates matters. There is a strong case for resident middle powers in the Indo-Pacific to step up to the plate and to actually be security providers for their own spheres of influence. So Japan and Australia and India and Indonesia should be able to do enough in a collective framework than having to rely on the United States all the time. In fact, when you bring in the United States, you're only, if I may say, strengthening the Chinese argument that you are small supplicants at the behest of the United States. A lot more autonomization of these middle powers in dealing with their respective spheres of influence collectively can actually go a long way in keeping the Chinese honest. And therefore, I see this happening because even Australia in the last few years, particularly under Albanese, have deepened the relations with Japan and deepened the relations with Philippines. And Japan is playing a bigger role now in the South Pacific as well. Philippines is also keen on playing a role. So if you look at Japan, if you look at Philippines, you look at Indonesia, look at India, working with Australia, that can have greater potential in terms of keeping the South Pacific islands, if I may say, balanced, as opposed to bringing the Americans in. Americans have always looked to do things on their own.
So now let's switch to another real economic powerhouse, at least in the region, that being South Korea. Okay? Sometimes we tend to, underestimate South Korea, but I mean, economically and particularly, I would say from a military standpoint, quite phenomenal. I mean, what they have with them, their wherewithal, their, if you take the KSS-3 destroyers, I mean, the KSS-3 submarines, the latest destroyers that they're coming out with, the KDX-3, etc.
Yeah.
So, becoming a huge defense exporter in their own right, I think, in every respect. Now, insofar as South Korea is concerned, you have again a huge US presence over there. And of course, they have a mutual defense treaty, as we discussed earlier, with the United States. But there are again stress points over there. The previous administration, of course, the feeling was that South Korea had swung, from a security standpoint at least, quite close to the United States. Now that we are in for elections in the first week of June, the expectation is that you might have a new administration in place, and the expectation is that it will be a Democratic administration, where there might be a course correction, and they might look at re-engaging, I would say, China and even Russia to some extent, to have a more rounded relationship with a larger group of nations. South Korea's biggest issue, of course, is that from their understanding, they feel that the American presence on the island is to defend them against a North Korean invasion. Yeah? And I think their concern is that in case a Taiwan issue were to escalate and blow up, not only will these forces be used over there, but even their bases will be used as part of this effort, which draws them into the conflict, which is not of their choosing and not of their making. That is the downside of being in an alliance, I would say, as against a partnership where you can pick and choose as to what you really want to do in that respect. So, how do you feel that South Korea is going to sort of balance this, in a sense, this quest for strategic autonomy while remaining in an alliance structure? Is it elusive, or can they sort of make some corrections in that direction?
Actually, it's the question you've asked is very interesting because it kind of triggered my mind. If you look at 4 countries, let me talk be a little macro and then come to the South Korea picture. You look at 4 of these countries there: South Korea, Japan, Philippines, and Australia, all along the Western Pacific front. They're all 4 dynamic democracies. And what you see apart from Japan in these 3 countries, South Korea, Philippines, and Australia, is that the change of regime in these countries flips their approaches and flips their orientation between China and the United States. And that is what complicates matters even more. In fact, we've seen this in Australia between the Liberal coalition, which has tended to be more anti-China, and the Labour, whether it's Kevin Rudd now, being more pro-China. We have seen this in Philippines between Noynoy Aquino to Duterte, and now, of course, to Marcos Jr. We have seen this a lot in South Korea as well. And there are apprehensions that if the conservatives are back, you'll once again have a problem because there'll be a natural, swinging back to China. So that is one problem. Go back to 2016 when Park Geun-hye was president, and when the Americans were literally thrusting the THAAD down their throat. And China effectively weaponized their tourism into Jeju Island to get Park Geun-hye to reverse policy and to tell the Americans, take back your THAAD, we're not going to militarize. So South Korea's problem is they found it very difficult to do so. South Korea's problems are twofold. One, they have a security alliance with the United States, and they've been feeling that somewhere down the line, Japan is being prioritized at their expense, right? And they're a little concerned that the forces that they have there, you rightly said, they might be used elsewhere. They're also being considered as superfluous to requirement, right? So that's one concern there. The second concern is for South Korea's economy, the semiconductor industry is huge, and they have lost a lot of business to China. They have lost of the competitive edge in terms of technology to China, and their companies, whether it's Samsung or Hyundai or all these other companies, they need the markets of China. And that's why South Korea has had this problem between staying true to the alliance and actually coming out and speaking out, and actually now developing linkages and connective tissues with China. Post COVID, they have tended to speak nothing against China, which upsets China, also because they want to keep North Korea moderated. And so, this problem is something that South Korea has to deal with, but it's further complicated by changes of regimes, which is something that doesn't happen with Japan because the LDP largely stays in power. So, there's not too much of a change, there's a kind of a consensus here. Here, you have to deal with two kinds of disruptions. One is the duopoly between US and China, which they have to balance, and they also have to balance between the duopoly of the two coalitions that happen in the
Yeah,
South.
but the only thing is that if you are in an alliance structure,
Yeah.
then even if you have changes in regimes,
Yeah.
they have to function within certain boundaries.
Yeah.
You cannot go beyond those boundaries. Otherwise, the alliance structure breaks down.
Yeah.
If you were in a partnership, then that room is much greater.
Yeah.
But you get locked in, you get hemmed in, don't you?
But also, what happens is, South Korea actually may find itself a little more favorable. They have no Senkaku issue. They have no real issue or a dispute or an island or some territorial issue where China and the United States are at loggerheads. Unlike Japan, which needs the United States to play ball. So actually, South Korea can be in the alliance and is not required to do that much that Japan is required to do. So, for example, in the event, let's say that Taiwan is swooped in or swooped over, South Korea's troops may get involved, but South Korea could yet say that no, we are not necessarily part of it. But Japan would get involved regardless of their troops because their EEZ is transgressed. And we've seen a very clear shift in South Korea where they are not willing to speak out against China lately, which is why the Chip 4 alliance as well has not gone too far, which was actually expected by the United States, with Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. It's not gone far because they also want to have a chip, partnership with China, and you can't straddle both boats. So this is South Korea's dilemma that they face.
So let's switch to ASEAN. I mean,
Yeah.
we've covered a lot of ASEAN already. I mean, they are, I think, walking a tightrope right now.
Yeah.
And because a vast number of countries over there would not like to make a choice between these two large entities. That's China and the United States in any to take a side, because most of them at least are deeply entrenched in their economic engagement with China, and they would not like to see that disturbed. And that comes to the core issue of ASEAN centrality, where when ASEAN centrality, in case stresses in the area begin to rise, will ASEAN continue to play the prominent role it has been playing so far, or would it the fissures within the alliance start breaking down, or not within the alliance, within the grouping of nations, I would say, start breaking down, with each country sort of being forced to, you have the Laos and the Cambodia, which are very much in the Chinese camp, and you have other nations which we've already discussed, the Philippines, etc., which are, alliance partners, and these fissures will be difficult for them to reconcile.
I want to bring this up because I saw this very distinct shift in the ASEAN approach when I was at the BAO Forum in March. And they normally have this capstone session that they hold at the very end, which is normally done on South China Sea issues. And normally in the past, and I had attended BAO forums from 2015 to 2019, you would have a lot of ASEAN country participation. And whenever these issues would be discussed, they would be very crystal clear that, look, we want a cooperative relationship with China, but it cannot come without a enforceable code of conduct being agreed to at the earliest. And they had certain terms and conditions on how it should be done. Cut to 2025, 6 years later, and a lot of things have changed apart from COVID. You had similar delegations being there, but not focusing on insisting on this as a precondition, rather talking about joint development, cooperative partnership, the same language that Beijing talks, and actually spending a lot of time in admonishing Philippines. They were almost trying to make it out that Philippines is a spoiler, and Philippines is now playing truant in ASEAN's relationship with China. Now let's understand something. What has happened over the last 5-7 years in particular is a very discernible but a very subtle embedding of ASEAN within the economic and technological ecosystem of China. Just look at the figures of 2024. ASEAN-China trade is now a notch under $1 trillion. It's 985 billion. How can ASEAN ever think of infuriating a country with whom it has $1 trillion of trade? And if you look at what kind of trade is happening, there are two kinds here. One is the technology services trade is now becoming a bigger proportion to industrial trade, which used to be there. And if you look at the UNDP report that has come out on 2035, 2040, it says that ASEAN countries will account for 30% of the flow of chips, right, and semiconductors in this entire space. So at one level, ASEAN has the potential to be central, but to be central in a very different way, and that's in terms of underpinning the supply chain, semiconductor industry. But ASEAN by itself politically today is not coherent. So there is an economic quotient that ASEAN has, but ASEAN lacks the coherence today. So when you say ASEAN centrality, my question, counter question would be, is ASEAN even coherent to talk of centrality? You have countries taking individual pitches now
Absolutely.
and calling it ASEAN centrality. When ASEAN centrality was first articulated, what was the purpose and what was the objective? That ASEAN basically is non-antagonistic. It's central as in it's omni-aligned. It aligns with all countries and partners around it. It takes no positions. It's not part of the Chinese system, ecosystem, or the American system, but it productivizes its relations with everyone. Today, the problem is the center of gravity in ASEAN. No one knows where it is, right? So you have ASEAN not even able to deal with issues within ASEAN. I mean, on Myanmar, for instance, ASEAN is absent. The ASEAN process has failed in Myanmar. The ASEAN process fails on a number of issues. Countries take a different position. Philippines feels it is being betrayed by ASEAN, right? Malaysia says, don't ask me to take a position. Malaysia could less be concerned about Philippines, they're more concerned about the GCC. So ASEAN centrality in terms of the politics of it is in crisis. ASEAN centrality in its economics is very vibrant.
So, a follow-on question over there. Would you say the code of conduct is now dead in the water? Or will you think, because you talked about that, it not being discussed in the Bao Forum, and now that it will only be the declaration of conduct, or is there any chance of the COC going through?
Yeah, so last year when Jakarta was chairing ASEAN, we had the post-ministerial 10+1, which was held specifically. They agreed on a timeline, but they have, basically this timeline is basically kicking the can down the road.
It's a shifting timeline.
It's a shifting timeline. The goalposts have kept moving.
Yeah.
They now say 2026. Now the problem with 2026 is next year Philippines is a chair of ASEAN. How, I mean, if something is really going to pivot, I don't know how Philippines and China are going to be able to come up with a code of conduct. But very interestingly, a new dynamic has been injected into code of conduct business. And this is something also very interesting. There is now talk within ASEAN that China may be more acceptable to discuss a code of conduct for maritime engagements in Southeast Asia.
So not for the South China Sea.
Exactly. That's the point being made now.
Okay.
That if it's South China Sea, it's going to have to be on China's terms.
Right.
If you want to make it more appealing in that sense across the board, make it a non-China Sea but a Southeast Asia code of conduct. That brings in all the other seas into the picture.
But it includes the South China Sea.
Includes South China Sea, but it's much beyond South China Sea. So it brings the West Philippine Sea all into the picture. It not only applies to China and Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN countries, it applies to all countries in the ASEAN Regional Forum. Because the United States is also a player, India is also a player. So why not have a code of conduct? And the Chinese seem to be okay with it, because in that case, the China will basically be able to diffuse the situation much more.
And who's proposed this?
So this basically came up at last year. It probably was an Indonesian initiative, because Indonesia also has gone quiet on the Chinese, and that's something that one must look at. The Chinese have reached out to Jakarta and made it known to Prabowo. You've got 57% of world's nickel, right? Nickel is an ingredient in the EV industry. So why do you want to fight? And if you see, Jakarta has taken a position, Indonesia has taken a position that they don't want to escalate the Natuna Sea face-offs with China. On the contrary, they have been looking to engage with China. So this has come about within ASEAN, so we're now moving to almost like a post-code of conduct thing. Because a code of conduct without any compliance mechanism, the code of conduct without enforceable teeth is no code of conduct. It's nothing different than the declaration, right? So a code of conduct for engagements in maritime Southeast Asia is now being talked about, bringing in all the partners who are part of the ASEAN Regional Forum.
But that brings in the US and brings in everyone.
Russia brings in...
but in a sense, it might be a lot more difficult to develop a consensus now, if you have that many more players jumping in.
Yeah, so because the thought is that, even China wants some clarity. Because what has happened is, China has played a very smart game. Of course, in 2002, when they went for the declaration, they were just over $1 trillion. And ASEAN still had a larger GDP than them. Today, the things are flipped, right? But the point that China has been doing is every time ASEAN comes up with a draft, right? If it's not acceptable to the Chinese, they run it down saying that it's an American draft. This is American nudged. It may not be, but they claim it to be American nudged. So unless that draft appeals to them, everything else is a US position.
In fact, what I've been given to understand right
Yeah.
now is that you have a common draft,
Yeah.
but that common draft is really, every country has laid down their own position in that common draft. So it is if you want to reconcile that draft, it's a Herculean effort to try and to reconcile that draft, because
So-
there are so many things that cross purpose to each other which are in that common draft.
And probably China's had a role to play in this
Yeah,
as well,
yeah.
to break down consensus,
Yeah.
because these countries are different. Just as they used, Cambodia as a spoiler in the
Right.
2016 issue, when ASEAN got together and said we should all pass a resolution demanding of China that they submit to the writ of the Permanent Court of Arbitration with Philippines. They used Cambodia as a spoiler because they have a silent consensus principle in ASEAN, just like in NATO, where even a single country can hold up progress. So Cambodia said, it doesn't matter to me. I have nothing to do with South China Sea. And so I'm not going to sign on it. So what they have done is to get enough countries to articulate independent positions. So there is no collation of the ASEAN position. And if there is no consensus in ASEAN over what should be the draft, then it's like a diluted draft.
So lastly, I think we're going to run short of time. Let's come to India.
Yeah.
So India's position in the Western Pacific. I mean, so far we've got strong economic engagement with the area. We're large trading partners, including China, of course, which is our second largest trading partner, and therefore we have certainly an economic equity over there. But from a security standpoint, we've been again quite muted in the area. Our security footprint is light. We have a security engagement with several of the nations over there. We have maritime exercises that we do. We send ships in the area once or twice every year. We participate in major, international trade reviews, etc. We take part in RIMPAC with the United States. Malabar sometimes is held, in the Western Pacific and sometimes on the Indian Ocean side. So, while certainly we have a base level of military activity as well, but we've not increased it over the years. And there's one school of thought that we need to, another school of thought which says that our basic security interests at least lie in the Indian Ocean. And given the challenges that we have in the Indian Ocean and the expanse of the area and our limited wherewithal, it is better that we focus our attention in the Indian Ocean and we work out, arrangements with other nations and other players, be it Japan, be it South Korea, be it the United States, so that we can address our security concerns in a more economic manner, where you're not at long legs and everyone plays to their advantage. So, what would you say should be our best course of action?
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm also a strong votary that we should principally be an IOR player. Our Pacific, engagement right now, I would call it naval socialization. We are gregarious, so we are communitarian, so we go out there, but we have to complement the resident powers there. We can't be the principal players there. I think we have shown up as well. I don't think the kind of thing that we had discussed in earlier in terms of West Asia, where India probably should gather a footprint. I don't see that ever happening. And when I say ever, I think even if we, let's say, get to $20 trillion, I don't think there is a logic for us to get involved there, because those are the kind of conflicts that you want to stay out of. We don't have necessarily a leg in what happens in the Korean Peninsula in that sense, nor even with Taiwan, apart from the economic angle. I would say that we have to continue to build our interoperable, linkages with key countries. I, for one, have been saying that India can actually come together in a kind of an informal subset with 4 countries. I mentioned it slightly earlier: India, Japan, Indonesia, Australia. Right? Of course, Philippines is something where our relationship is going, but it's a little too, abrasive right now. If you go with Japan, Australia, Indonesia, India, I think it fits the bill very well. These are also 4 democracies right now, right? These are 4 very different countries. You have 2 global South countries and 2, kind of, if I may say, G7 plus OECD countries. These are also 4 countries who are resident powers of the Indo-Pacific. And I would stress that any investment in the residency of, middle powers will serve India better, because then it gives us leverage with China. It also gives us leverage with the United States. Otherwise, China picks us off saying that we are supplicants to the Americans, and then we drift away from the Americans and get more cozy with China. The Americans are not comfortable with accepting us in terms of sensitive technologies. Going forward, I believe two things will happen, and India will have this challenge up its sleeve. One, how do you make the Quad more substantive? Right now, India calls it a coordinating mechanism, but it has to go beyond coordination to some degree of depth of collaboration for it to make headway. But a factor that probably we should discuss at some point in time, BRICS has the potential to become maritime in the Indo-Pacific as well. Just look at the composition of BRICS, the expansion of BRICS. Leave out Ethiopia for now, and every other country who has joined BRICS is a maritime country. Now, and even the partner countries like Thailand, Malaysia, who want to join are also, and increasingly ASEAN countries are getting interested in BRICS. Imagine a situation 5 years down the line where BRICS will be not 10 countries, 9 countries, but let's say 15 countries or 20 countries, and most of ASEAN countries would have joined the BRICS. There is every likelihood that China and Russia will use the BRICS forum to drive an Indo-Pacific maritime strategy that's a counter to the Quad. Now, that time we will have a challenge up our sleeve. We are in BRICS, we are in Quad. How do we manage the competitive and contradictory and paradoxical edges of both of them? This will place a huge, kind of thing. So we have to focus on economic diplomacy. We have to focus on providing economic public goods. We have to focus on economic securitization as opposed to militaristic securitization.
Seen. So I think we'll end over here. We've covered a lot of ground again. And I mean, these are interesting times. So as you said, lots of new challenges and new opportunities also, I would say, that we're likely to face in the future, particularly in the maritime field. And we would require to be, I would say, dexterous and a lot more flexible and a lot more pragmatic in choosing our options to address our security concerns in times to come. So remains for me once again to thank you for participating in this. Delightful to have this conversation, and look forward to many such conversations in future.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.